In this episode, we're going to build a practical way to navigate major security and privacy expectation sources that beginners often hear about, but struggle to connect into a coherent picture. FISMA, HIPAA, Executive Orders, and GDPR. The Certified in Governance, Risk, and Compliance, CGRC, mindset is not about memorizing legal language, because it's about understanding what drives obligations, what scope those obligations apply to, and what kinds of behaviors and evidence are expected so an organization can demonstrate it is acting responsibly. Beginners often treat these names like four separate worlds, but in real governance work they interact, overlap, and sometimes create tension between security goals and privacy goals. Another beginner trap is overreach, where you apply requirements too broadly or claim compliance based on partial understanding. And a related trap is underreach, where you assume a law or directive doesn't apply when it actually shapes your obligations. Our goal is to develop a calm interpretation method that keeps you grounded in applicability, roles, and evidence. When you can do that, these terms stop being intimidating and start becoming understandable drivers you can reason about. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first key is recognizing that these sources are not all the same kind of thing. Federal Information Security Modernization Act, FISMA, is a U.S. federal law that drives information security requirements for federal agencies and for certain systems and services that support them, often influencing how security programs are structured and assessed. Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, is a U.S. law that includes privacy and security requirements around protected health information, shaping how healthcare-related data must be handled by covered entities and business associates. Executive orders are directives issued by the U.S. President that can shape federal priorities and requirements, often influencing agency actions, procurement expectations, and security program direction, though they usually require implementation through policies, regulations, or agency guidance to become operational requirements for specific organizations. General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, is an EU regulation that sets privacy requirements for processing personal data, with strong expectations around lawful basis, transparency, rights, and safeguards, and it can apply to organizations outside the EU when they process data related to individuals in the EU. These differences matter because interpretation depends on what kind of authority you are dealing with and how obligations flow from that authority into your program. A mature CGRC approach begins by naming the type of driver because it informs what evidence and governance structure you will need. Applicability is where navigation becomes practical because each of these drivers has a scope trigger that tells you whether and how it applies. FISMA is typically relevant when you are a federal agency or when you operate systems on behalf of federal agencies, including contractors and service providers in certain contexts, which means your system boundary and your relationship to federal information and services are central to scope. HIPAA is triggered by the handling of protected health information in healthcare contexts, and it depends on whether an organization is a covered entity or a business associate, and whether the data involved meets the definition of protected health information. Executive orders can affect organizations directly if they are federal agencies, and they can affect contractors indirectly through procurement requirements, contract language, and agency policies that implement the order's goals. GDPR is triggered by processing personal data connected to individuals in the EU, and its reach can extend beyond geography when an organization offers goods or services to those individuals or monitors their behavior. Beginners often assume applicability is obvious, but it usually requires careful boundary and data flow thinking. The CGRC habit is to ask what data, what systems, what relationships, and what jurisdictions are involved, then define scope explicitly. That prevents confusion and helps ensure you do not miss obligations. FISMA expectations can be understood as a structure for federal information security governance and risk management, emphasizing that systems must be categorized, risks must be managed, controls must be selected and assessed, and security posture must be monitored and reported. Beginners sometimes think FISMA is a single checklist of controls, but a more accurate view is that it drives a program approach where agencies and supporting organizations must implement structured security processes. The practical takeaway is that FISMA encourages formalization, such as documented system boundaries, assigned roles, risk assessments, security controls, and evidence of assessment and authorization activities. FISMA also tends to push continuous monitoring expectations, meaning security is not a one-time certification, but a sustained operational activity. Overreach happens when someone claims a system is compliant with FISMA without understanding the system's categorization, the scope of authorization, or the evidence required for assessment and ongoing monitoring. Underreach happens when a contractor assumes FISMA is only the agency's concern, ignoring shared responsibility and contract obligations. A mature navigation approach treats FISMA as a driver of disciplined security governance, with careful attention to boundaries, roles, and evidence. HIPAA introduces a dual focus that is central to CGRC thinking. Privacy expectations and security expectations intertwined around a specific data category. The practical view is that HIPAA expects organizations handling protected health information to protect confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that information while also respecting privacy rules about use and disclosure. Beginners sometimes treat HIPAA as purely privacy, but security is a major component, and failures can occur through poor access control, weak auditability, or improper disposal as much as through improper disclosure. HIPAA also emphasizes administrative safeguards, which highlights that governance and process are not optional extras. This includes policies, training, incident response processes, and risk analysis, because protecting health information requires consistent behavior as much as technical controls. Overreach can appear when organizations treat any health-related data as automatically protected health information without confirming context and definitions, which can create unnecessary burden, while underreach can appear when organizations fail to recognize that a vendor handling health information becomes a business associate with responsibilities. A mature approach defines what data is protected health information, where it flows, who touches it, and what agreements and controls are required to protect it. That scope and role clarity is what turns HIPAA from a scary acronym into a manageable program driver. Executive orders can be confusing because they often describe priorities and desired outcomes rather than providing a direct operational checklist for every organization. The practical way to interpret an executive order in compliance work is to treat it as a top-level directive that may lead to concrete requirements through agency policies, procurement rules, and implementation guidance. Beginners sometimes overreach by treating the executive order itself as if it instantly creates detailed obligations for all organizations, but often the obligations become concrete when agencies translate the order into specific policies or when contracts incorporate required practices. At the same time, beginners can underreach by ignoring executive orders entirely, even though they can shape major changes in how government agencies evaluate security, how vendors are assessed, and what evidence is expected. A mature navigation approach is to ask how the executive order's direction is implemented in your environment, such as whether your organization is a federal agency, whether you are a contractor serving federal agencies, or whether your customers require adherence as part of procurement. The program then aligns controls, documentation, and evidence to the implemented requirements rather than to vague interpretations. This is another place where scope and driver identification prevent confusion, because the order's impact depends on relationship and context. When you interpret executive orders as governance drivers that cascade into operational requirements, you avoid both overclaiming and ignoring. GDPR adds a global privacy dimension that often forces organizations to think carefully about personal data in a way that goes beyond traditional security. The practical core of GDPR is that processing personal data requires a lawful basis, must be transparent, must respect data subject rights, and must include appropriate safeguards and accountability. Beginners often think of GDPR as a set of security controls, but it is more accurate to see it as a privacy governance framework with strong accountability requirements, including documentation of processing activities, clear purposes, and controls that support rights like access, correction, and deletion. GDPR also influences security expectations because it expects appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect personal data, which includes protecting confidentiality and integrity. But the privacy obligations extend further into how data is used and retained. Overreach can occur when an organization assumes any interaction with the EU automatically triggers the full scope of GDPR obligations for all systems, while underreach can occur when an organization assumes it is safe because it is not physically in the EU, ignoring the regulation's extraterritorial reach. A mature approach focuses on identifying whether personal data related to individuals in the EU is processed, what purposes are involved, what systems are in scope, and what controls and evidence are needed to demonstrate accountability. This scope-focused thinking is exactly what CGRC trains you to do. One of the most important navigation skills is recognizing that security and privacy expectations often overlap, but are not identical, and the overlap can create practical design constraints. For example, logging and monitoring are valuable for integrity and non-repudiation, but if logs collect excessive personal data or are retained too long, privacy risk increases. Similarly, encryption supports confidentiality and privacy, but encryption alone does not guarantee privacy if the organization uses personal data for purposes people did not expect. A mature program designs controls that meet both security and privacy goals, such as limiting access to logs, minimizing personal data and monitoring records, and defining retention schedules that balance accountability with privacy. This is especially relevant when multiple drivers apply at once, like when a healthcare organization processes personal data that may be in scope for both HIPAA and broader privacy obligations, or when a contractor serving government customers must meet federal security expectations while also respecting privacy requirements. Beginners often want a simple one-driver worldview, but real environments have multiple drivers. CGRC reasoning handles this by mapping requirements to controls and ensuring evidence supports each obligation without duplicating work unnecessarily. The program becomes coherent when you treat these drivers as inputs into a single governance operating model. Evidence and accountability are where these drivers become operational, because each one expects the organization to be able to demonstrate responsibility, not just claim it. For FISMA-driven environments, evidence often includes clear system boundaries, risk assessments, control implementation records, and ongoing monitoring outputs tied to authorization and governance decisions. For HIPAA contexts, evidence includes policies, training, risk analysis, access controls, incident handling records, and documentation of appropriate use and disclosure decisions, supported by agreements where required. For executive order-driven requirements, evidence often depends on how the order is implemented, such as procurement-driven requirements and reporting expectations, which means evidence may include attestations, assessments, and documentation that align with agency policies. For GDPR, evidence includes records of processing, documented purposes, lawful basis reasoning, rights handling processes, and security measures appropriate to risk, along with proof that these are maintained over time. Beginners sometimes think evidence is something you assemble later, but mature programs generate evidence through normal operations. Evidence is also where integrity is protected because consistent records show that the organization's words match its actions. In CGRC work, evidence is how you convert complex legal and policy expectations into practical assurance. Another critical navigation skill is avoiding the false belief that compliance with one driver automatically means compliance with another. For example, strong security controls aligned with a federal security expectation may still leave privacy obligations unmet if data is used beyond defined purposes or retained too long. Similarly, privacy-focused compliance may still leave operational security gaps if integrity and availability are not managed, leading to incidents that harm individuals and the organization. A mature program treats each driver's unique intent seriously and maps it to controls that satisfy that intent, while still looking for controls that provide multi-benefit coverage. This is where overreach and underreach show up most clearly. Overreach claims you are fully covered because you follow one program, while underreach ignores unique obligations because they are inconvenient. The CGRC approach is to define scope and obligations carefully, then build control sets that address both the shared foundations and the unique expectations. That is also how you communicate honestly to stakeholders, because you can state what is covered and why, without vague promises. Honest, accurate communication is itself part of governance integrity. As we close, navigating FISMA, HIPAA, executive orders, and GDPR is about applying a consistent interpretation method rather than trying to memorize legal details. You identify what kind of driver it is, clarify applicability through data, system boundaries, and relationships, and then translate obligations into controls with clear ownership and evidence. FISMA emphasizes disciplined federal security governance, structured risk management, and ongoing monitoring within defined system boundaries. HIPAA emphasizes protecting protected health information through both privacy rules and security safeguards, supported by administrative processes and role clarity. Executive orders act as top-level directives that often become operational through agency policies and procurement requirements, meaning you interpret their impact through implementation and context. GDPR emphasizes privacy accountability, lawful processing, transparency, rights, and appropriate safeguards for personal data related to individuals in the EU, with scope that can extend beyond geography. A mature CGRC program integrates these drivers into a single operating model through requirement mapping, control selection, evidence generation, and continuous maintenance. When you do that, complex expectations become manageable, and you avoid both overclaiming and accidental noncompliance, which is the practical goal of governance, risk, and compliance work.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.